The 8,256th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. At the outset of the meeting, I should like to take a moment to remember those killed yesterday in Gaza, as well as all those Palestinian, Israeli, and others who have died as a result of a conflict that has endured for far too long. I ask you all to raise to observe a minute of silence in memory of them. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Nikolai Mladenov, Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and personal representative of the Secretary General, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. Mr. Mladenov is joining us via video teleconference from Jerusalem. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Nikolai Mladenov.
Thank you, Madam President. Members of the Security Council. For the people of Gaza, yesterday was a day of tragedy. There are no other words with which to describe what actually happened. There is no justification for the killing. There is no excuse. It serves no one. It certainly does not serve the cause of peace. My heart weighs heavy today as I begin by expressing my condolences to the families of those killed yesterday and in the last 6 weeks of demonstrations in Gaza. Who can possibly find words to console the mother of a child that has been killed? Who? I call on all to join me today in condemning in the strongest possible terms the actions that have led to the loss of many lives in Gaza. Israel has a responsibility to calibrate its use of force, to not use lethal force except as a last resort under imminent threat of death or serious injury. It must protect its borders, but it must do so proportionally and investigate every incident that has led to a loss of human life. Hamas, which has controlled Gaza for over a decade, must not use the protests as cover to attempt to place bombs at the fence and create provocations. Its operatives must not hide among the demonstrators and risk the lives of civilians. Madam President, tens of thousands of people in Gaza have been protesting for over 6 weeks now. People who live in abject poverty, who survive in prison-like conditions, who live with no prospect for the day after. These people want their voices heard. They want a future beyond mere survival. Their leaders have failed them. The promises that they have made to them have not been delivered. And now the people are angry. But their anger, if not channeled in a constructive manner, will lead to more destruction and suffering. Whatever we may think of their motivation, we have an obligation to hear their plight. They have lived through 3 devastating conflicts. Their lives are marked by personal anguish, scarred by national tragedy, marred by daily suffering caused by leaders who use them for their own political ends. For 10 years, they have lived under the control of Hamas, separated from their families in the West Bank, isolated behind crippling Israeli closures. The cycle of violence in Gaza needs to end. And for it to end, it needs every single one of us to put their best efforts into preventing an explosion that can drag the whole region into another deadly confrontation. The international community must step in and prevent war. We need to move forward quickly and effectively on all projects that have been discussed for months and months to solve the energy, water and health crisis of the population. We can only do this in coordination with Israel, with the Palestinian Authority and with Egypt. But before all of that, the senseless violence needs to stop. Mr. President, yesterday an estimated 35,000 people participated in demonstrations in Gaza and hundreds in the West Bank, cities of Ramallah, Bethlehem, Hebron, Jericho, Nablus, and in East Jerusalem, all part of the Great March of Return, as well as in protest to the relocation of the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. While no fatalities were reported in the West Bank, where limited clashes took place between demonstrators and Israeli security forces at several checkpoints, the situation in Gaza deteriorated throughout the day, particularly along the perimeter fence. According to various reports, at least 60 people were killed throughout yesterday, including 6 children, and more than 1,300 were reportedly injured by live ammunition and rubber bullets. 1 Israeli soldier was wounded and taken to hospital for treatment. Since the beginning of the protests on March 30th, over 100 people have been killed, including 13 children, over half of whom yesterday alone. This constituted the bloodiest day in Gaza, with the highest death and injury toll since the conflict of 2014. Hamas and Islamic Jihad have acknowledged that among those killed were members of their organizations, and the Israeli Defense Forces claims that at least 24 had linked to militant activities. Under cover of protests, Hamas and other militants have also engaged in violent and provocative acts, including the placing of improvised explosive devices at the perimeter fence, and other attempts to breach it with the intent of perpetrating attacks. According to the UNDSS, at least 1 IED reportedly detonated against an IDF vehicle during an incursion. 18 airstrikes and 8 shelling incidents were also carried out by the Israeli security forces on 26 Hamas targets in retaliation for what Israel has classified as violent acts. Madam President, against this backdrop, hospitals in Gaza report an unfolding crisis of essential medical supplies. Drugs and equipment is needed to treat those who have been injured. The United Nations humanitarian coordinator, who is currently in Gaza, yesterday visited the Shifa hospital, where there is a shortage of beds for the number of wounded arriving from the protests at the fence. He witnessed firsthand patients being brought in on stretchers and left in the hospital's courtyard, which was being used as a triage area. I appeal to Israel, to Egypt, to the Palestinian authorities to facilitate the exit from Gaza of the seriously wounded for medical treatment, and I welcome steps reportedly taken in this direction by Egypt. Madam President, I would like to take the opportunity to salute the bravery of the medical staff who continue to put their own lives at risk, such as those working for the Palestinian Red Crescent Society who have endured casualties of their own. I'm deeply saddened to note the death of another health worker yesterday during the demonstrations, and I reiterate the inviolability under international law of health facilities and medical personnel. Journalists have also been among those injured in yesterday's demonstrations. The dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, about which I have reported time and again in this chamber over the past year, has been compounded by the fact that the Palestinian Authority continues to withhold the payment of salaries to some 20,000 civil service employees in Gaza. To further complicate a dismal picture, on the 4th and on the 11th of May, demonstrators destroyed most of the facilities at the Gaza side of the Kerem Shalom crossing, the main point of entry for goods and materials into the Gaza Strip. Members of my team have conducted an initial assessment of the site, and I can report that the damage is extensive and will hinder deliveries of fuel and much-needed goods to Gaza for weeks ahead. As we speak, the United Nations is working with the Palestinian Authority and with Israel to bring in life-saving assistance, despite the destruction and the extensive damage to the crossing. Mr. President, whoever orchestrated that destruction shares in the responsibility of worsening the suffering of 2 million people in Gaza. Madam President, the Secretary General and I have repeatedly called on all to exercise restraint, for all necessary steps to be taken to avoid an escalation, and for all incidents to be fully investigated. I have engaged with all sides to this effect. Public statements and messages by Hamas indicate the intention to use mass protests to infiltrate into Israel and attack Israelis. Such statements and action endanger the lives of both Israelis and Palestinians and cannot be justified. I wish to underline yet again that it is imperative that civilians, particularly children, not be targeted by anyone, use or not be used for cover of militant activity or be put in risk or in danger in any way. Madam President, as the violence continues, technical problems have also resurfaced in further decreasing the electricity supply and have currently caused some 22 hours of blackouts in Gaza. This is a critical reminder of the fragility of Gaza's infrastructure. Starting tomorrow, the United Nations, together with international partners, will need to focus and redouble efforts to implement projects that will have an immediate impact on improving the electricity, water and health situation as a matter of urgency. The developments in Gaza are a painful reminder, an extremely painful reminder of the devastating consequences of the continued absence of peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I would like to reiterate this message, particularly as Palestinians commemorate the Nakba Day, or the Day of the Catastrophe, by which they remember the displacement during the war of 1948-49, and as they continue to demonstrate in Gaza and the West Bank over the coming days. We must step up our efforts in support of a peaceful resolution to the conflict. We must collectively call on all to refrain from unilateral measures that only steer us away from a peace process and instead work to end the occupation and advance the goal of a just and sustainable peace, culminating ultimately in two states, Israel and Palestine, of which Gaza is an integral part, two states living side by side in peace, security, and prosperity. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Mladenov for his briefing, and now I give the floor to the members of the Security Council. I give the floor to the representative of Kuwait.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, we'd like to thank you for your speedy response to our request to hold this emergency session. Moreover, we'd like to thank Mr. Nikolai Mladenov, the Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, for this important briefing today on the tragic events that have recently taken place in the occupied Palestinian territories, especially in the Gaza Strip. We would like to condemn in the strongest terms the massacre perpetrated by the Israeli occupation authorities yesterday, which have led over to the killing of 52 persons and thousands of wounds who have joined the martyrs that have fallen since the Palestinian question and tragedy began. And this is a part of the commemoration of the Nakba that has taken place 70 years ago. And these Israeli violations are simply a continuation of Israel's violations of international humanitarian law and international law and the Security Council resolutions. They would not have continued if the Security Council has taken a firm stand against them and called Israel to stop these practices. And here we would like to express our regret that the Security Council was unable to adopt the draft statement that the Kuwait has suggested yesterday, and which calls upon ending Israel's practices and conducting a transparent and independent investigation into the massacres perpetrated against the unarmed Palestinians and holding those responsible accountable. And in the Council's continued inability to take any measure in order to establish an investigative mechanism, then we will make a move in the General Assembly or in the Human Rights Council in order to guarantee that those perpetrating these acts are held accountable and do not live in impunity. And we would also like to submit suggestions to avoid the excessive use of force by the Israeli occupation authorities and the continued violence. And we call for taking measures that would guarantee offering international protection to the Palestinian people. And here we would like to confirm what has been stipulated by Resolution 605 and 904 by the Security Council in order to apply the Fourth Geneva Convention on what is happening in the occupied Palestinian territories and the need to offer international protection to the unarmed Palestinian people. Madam President, we express our deep concern over the unilateral measures that Israel, the occupying authority, is undertaking. And these aim to change facts on the ground in the occupied territories, the most prominent of which is the continued settlement activity and the expansion of existing settlements, which are illegal and illegitimate measures that are a clear violation of Security Council resolutions, international law, and especially Resolution 2334. Moreover, transferring some diplomatic missions to Jerusalem is a clear violation of Security Council resolutions of relevance, especially resolutions 476 and 478. These resolutions consider such unilateral measures to be null and void. We would like to confirm that such measures that violate international law only serve to undermine efforts to achieve peace, deepen tensions, and cause and enrage anger, as well as push the region towards more violence, chaos, and instability. The state of Kuwait supports Palestinian demands in order to activate some international mechanisms that currently exist, such as the International Quartet, by expanding its membership to include other regional elements, provided that it remains under the aegis of the United Nations as a sponsor of the peace process. Moreover, we support all legal and peaceful measures taken by the sisterly state of Palestine at the national and international levels in order to entrench and enhance its sovereignty over Al-Quds al-Sharif and the occupied Palestinian territories. We also confirm that the peace required must start with an end to Israeli occupation that is about to complete its 51st year in a few days. And this must be based on international legitimacy resolutions as well as the Land for Peace principle and the roadmap and the Arab Peace Initiative that was adopted by all Arab states at the Beirut Summit in the year 2002. And this must be based on Israel's withdrawal from all Palestinian, Syrian, and Lebanese territories occupied, and until the June 1967 borders. And it must also deal with all final status solutions and must lead to the enjoyment of the Palestinian people of all their political legitimate rights, including the right to self-determination and establishing an independent state with East Jerusalem as their capital. The Palestinian people are looking to the United Nations and the Security Council to activate what this organization has taken upon itself in order to achieve the maintenance of international peace and security. Here, we would like to renew our full solidarity with the sisterly Palestinian people in order to defend their just cause and their legitimate rights, including their historic and firm rights in Jerusalem, which have been guaranteed by the relevant international resolutions. We confirm that East Jerusalem is the capital of the State of Palestine. We call on countries to recognize the State of Palestine and occupied East Jerusalem as its capital. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Kuwait for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Today's session was called to discuss the issue of violence in the Middle East. We are all concerned about violence in the Middle East. The United States deplores the loss of human life. But there is a lot of violence throughout the region, and I will note that the double standard is all too common in this chamber and working overtime today. Last week, Iranian forces attacked Israeli positions on the Golan Heights by launching rockets from Syria. This was a reckless provocation and escalation that must be stopped. It is an example of regional violence that should occupy our attention here in the Security Council. Also last week, Iranian proxy forces in Yemen launched missiles into Saudi Arabia. It was not the first time they have done it. This, too, is regional violence that should occupy our attention here in the Security Council. In recent days, Hamas terrorists, backed by Iran, have incited attacks against Israeli security forces and infrastructure. That is violence that should occupy our attention, too. The common thread in all of this is the destabilizing conduct of the Iranian regime, a regime that insists on promoting violence throughout the Middle East while depriving its own people of basic human rights. The United States welcomes a discussion of this violence in the Middle East. We welcome discussing the ways we can cooperate with each other to put an end to this violence. There is far too little discussion in the Security Council on Iran's destabilizing presence in Syria, its promotion of violence in Yemen, its support for terrorism in Gaza, and its dangerous and illegal weapons buildup in Lebanon. However, in the minds of some, today's meeting was not called to discuss any of those examples of violence in the Middle East. Today's meeting was called to discuss the violence that some suggest was connected with yesterday's opening of the United States Embassy in Jerusalem. For some people, the embassy opening is said to be a reason to engage in violence. How is that justified? As our president said when he announced the decision in December, the location of our embassy has no bearing on the specific boundaries of Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem or the resolution of contested borders. It has no bearing on Jerusalem's holy sites. It does not prejudge whatever the parties might negotiate in a peace agreement. It does not undermine the prospects for peace in any way. And yet, for some, this is supposedly a cause for violence. But let's remember that the Hamas terrorist organization has been inciting violence for years, long before the United States decided to move our embassy. In recent days, multiple news organizations have documented the Hamas incitement in Gaza. They have reported that Hamas maps and social media show the fastest routes to reach Israeli communities in case demonstrators make it through the security fence. They have reported on Hamas messages over loudspeakers that urge demonstrators to burst through the fence, falsely claiming Israeli soldiers were fleeing, when in fact they were not. The same loudspeakers are used by Hamas to urge the crowds to, quote, get closer to the security fence. Hamas has attacked the Karem Shalom crossing, the biggest entry point in Gaza for fuel, food, and medical supplies. This is how determined they are to make the lives of the Palestinian people miserable. They light Molotov cocktails attached to kites on fire and attempt to fly them into Israel to cause as much destruction as possible. When asked yesterday why he put a swastika on his burning kite, the terrorist responded, quote, "The Jews go crazy when you mention Hitler," unquote. This is what is endangering the people of Gaza. Make no mistake, Hamas is pleased with the results from yesterday. I asked my colleagues here in the Security Council, who among us would accept this type of activity on your border? No one would. No country in this chamber would act with more restraint than Israel has. In fact, the records of several countries here today suggest they would be much less restrained. Those who suggest that the Gaza violence has anything to do with the location of the American embassy are sorely mistaken. Rather, the violence comes from those who reject the existence of the state of Israel in any location. Such a motivation, the destruction of a United Nations member state, is so illegitimate as to not be worth our time in the Security Council, other than the time it takes to denounce it. Yesterday's opening of our embassy in Jerusalem is a cause for celebration for the American people. Moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem was the right thing to do. It reflects the will of the American people. It reflects our sovereign right to decide the location of our embassy, a right that everyone in this room claims for their own country. Importantly, moving our embassy to Jerusalem also reflects the reality that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. It has served as Israel's capital since the founding of the state. It is the ancient capital of the Jewish people. There is no plausible peace agreement under which Jerusalem would no longer remain the capital of Israel. Recognizing this reality makes peace more achievable, not less. The United States is prepared to support peace negotiations and a peace agreement in every way. We want nothing more than peace, a peace in which people of all faiths are free to worship in Jerusalem, a peace in which the rights of all people are respected and the future prospects of all people is bright. That peace will only be achieved if it is rooted in the realities that too many choose to deny. The United States' action yesterday promoted the reality and the desire for peace. It is our sincere wish that the nations of the world will join us in this pursuit of credible, realistic, and enduring peace. As I conclude, I want to take a moment to mark the 70th anniversary of Israel's independence. In this United Nations Security Council, on behalf of the American people, I congratulate our friends in Israel on the remarkable achievement of 70 years of independence. From humble and desperate beginnings, a proud people have realized the prophet Isaiah's vision of a light unto the nations. May the next 70 years be ones of strength, of hope, and of peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of United States for her statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President, and thank you very much to Mr. Mladenov for that very sobering briefing. I'd like to start by thanking him and his staff for everything they're doing to try and calm down the violence, and also echo his tribute to the medical staff on the ground and his appeal for facilitation of evacuation of the wounded. Madam President, we've seen a concatenation of loss of life, casualties, volume of live fire in Gaza yesterday, and this has been shocking and I think appalling to most of us. It is a familiar, depressingly familiar pattern that we have seen over recent weeks, and it includes the deaths of children. At a highly sensitive time in the region, we call for calm and we call for restraint. A further escalation of violence serves no one's interests. It is only destructive to peace efforts and to wider regional security. Madam President, we understand that 60 people were killed yesterday in Gaza, 6 of them children. Around 2,771 people were reported injured, and that included over 1,300 by live ammunition. The death toll on Monday means that more 90 Palestinians have been killed in the past 6 weeks for approaching the fence that has been placed round Gaza. There is an urgent need, we believe, to establish the facts around yesterday's events, including why such a volume of live fire continues to be deemed justified. The Palestinian right to peaceful protest is undeniable, but at the same time, we are deeply concerned that peaceful protests in Gaza are being exploited by extremist elements. For example, we've seen IDF troops targeted by IEDs, and we've seen the use of Molotov cocktails. This is not acceptable. The Palestinians have a right to peaceful protest, and Israel has an undeniable right to protect its borders from Hamas and other terrorist groups and threats. The United Kingdom remains strongly supportive of Israel's right to defend itself. We recognise today as a sensitive anniversary for the Palestinians. We implore Israel to act with restraint in accordance with international law and, more than anything, to ensure that its security forces do not resort to the use of excessive force. The volume of live fire used in Gaza yesterday and the consequent number of deaths is distressing and cannot be ignored by the Council. I want to reiterate the United Kingdom's support for independent and transparent investigations into the events that have taken place and in recent weeks, and including the extent to which Israeli security forces' rules of engagement are in line with international law. The death toll alone warrants such a comprehensive inquiry, and we continue to urge that the findings of these investigations be made public, and if wrongdoing is found, that those responsible be held to account. Madam President, our position on the status of Jerusalem and the move of the American Embassy is well known. Our position is clear and long-standing. It should be the status of Jerusalem should be determined in a negotiated settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and Jerusalem should ultimately be the shared capital of the Israeli and Palestinian states. We need to look forward and we need to work urgently towards a resolution of the long-standing issues between Israel and the Palestinian people. Like this Council, the United Kingdom is committed to a two-state solution with Jerusalem as a shared capital and to achieving peace and stability in the wider region. We see negotiations towards a two-state solution as the best way to end the occupation and to meet the national aspirations of the Jewish and Palestinian peoples. But now more than ever, Madam President, we need a political process that delivers a two-state solution. We agree with the envoy that the situation in Gaza is desperate and deteriorating, and that the international community must step up its efforts. To that end, Madam President, I'd like to close by making a request of the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process that he and his office bring forward proposals to address the situation in Gaza. These should include easing restrictions on access and movement, and it should include international support for urgent infrastructure and economic development projects. We also reiterate our support for the Egyptian-led reconciliation process and the return of the Palestinian Authority to full administration of the Gaza Strip. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of plurinational state of Bolivia.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President. My delegation wishes to thank you for having convened this meeting, and also the delegation of Kuwait for having called for it to be convened. Laila Anwar Al-Gandor, 8 months old. Els Ilbin Muhammad Al-Samak, 14 years old. Misal Fahd El-Sad El-Sheikh Khalid, 15 years old. Ahmed Adel Musa Al-Shahed, 16 years old. Sahed Mohammed Abu Al-Ked, 16 years old. Ibrahim Ahmed Al-Saka, 18 years old. Iman Ali Sadiq Al-Sheikh, 19 years old. Saeed Mohammed Hassan Ahmad, 19 years old. Matasen Fasi Abu Luli, 20 years old. Anas Hamdam Salim Kader, 21 years old. These are the 10 first people on the list of those who were killed by the security forces of the occupying power yesterday in Gaza. Today we had a minute of silence to recall the victims. But I think that minute of silence, too, also recalls the inoperative nature of the Security Council, that this Security Council, not just in recent years, but in recent decades, has failed the Palestinian people. And so, as a member of the Security Council, in the presence of my brother, the ambassador of Palestine, with us today, and through him, I wish to ask for forgiveness and say how sorry I am to the 6 million of Palestinian refugees who've lost their homes and today live in camps far from the lands that saw their birth. I am sorry that for 70 years, the promise of the creation of the State of Palestine has not been fulfilled. I am sorry for the more than 50 years of occupation and the continued increase of Israeli settlements in occupied Palestinian territory. The international community has failed you. I am sorry at the 10 years of inhumane blockade of Gaza and the building of a shameful wall along the West Bank. I am sorry that there are Israeli checkpoints that they must pass through daily to go to work. The international community has failed you. I wish to ask for forgiveness from the over 97 Palestinian men and women, 12 of whom were children, who lost their lives in the last 6 weeks since the Great March of Return began. The international community, this Security Council, has failed you. I wish to ask forgiveness and say I'm sorry to the over 12,000 Palestinian men, women, older people, and children who were injured by the Israeli aggression. Over 3,500 of whom were injured in various degrees by live munition, leading to permanent disability. The international community has failed you. I wish to say I am sorry to the more than 300 girls and boys held in Israeli prisons or detention centers, some subject to military courts, others simply under administrative detention. The international community has failed you. I wish to say I am sorry to the 169 health workers who were wounded while they provided emergency services to the Palestinians along the fence separating Israel from Gaza. They, too, have been failed by the international community. I wish to say I'm sorry because there were 18 ambulances damaged in recent weeks, hospitals and health centers in Gaza which have collapsed without enough fuel, water, and electric supplies to operate. I wish to say I'm sorry because of the 4 hours of electricity provided per day. The international community has failed them. Madam President, I believe it is necessary to clarify that although there are two parties to this conflict, so-called conflict, it's not really a conflict. We're talking about an illegal occupation. We are talking about an occupying power and an occupied territory. They are not on an equal footing. I was saying that Israel is the occupying power. The other, Palestine, is an occupied people. There is a historic, glaring inequality. One of the parties has used and continues to use force to occupy the territory of the other. One of the parties forcibly displaces civilians, confiscates lands, demolishes houses, and transfers settlers to illegally built settlements. One of the parties is blockading Gaza with terrible humanitarian consequences. As Mr. Mladenov appropriately said, Gaza has become a kind of prison subject to these conditions. Madam President, added to this, the unilateral decision of the government of the United States of America to transfer its embassy to the occupied city of Jerusalem does nothing but inflame spirits. Once again, Bolivia expresses its strongest condemnation for this decision, which violates resolutions of the Security Council and of the General Assembly. The United States, which supports the occupying power, has become an obstacle to peace. It is part of the problem, not part of the solution. Madam President, after the events we have witnessed, Bolivia believes that the mechanisms of the International Criminal Court should be triggered to conduct an investigation which identifies those responsible and bring them to justice for the crimes committed during the Great March of Return. Against this scenario, we express our firm commitment with all international efforts leading to a peaceful solution to this conflict. And we add our support to initiatives such as the Quartet's Roadmap, the Madrid Principles, the Arab Peace Initiative, and others, which are guarantees for fair, lasting peace so that both peoples can live within recognized secure borders. We reaffirm our conviction that the only solution over the long term is the two-state solution, which will finally consolidate a free, sovereign, independent state of Palestine with borders previous to 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital, in accordance with the relevant resolutions of the Security Council and of the General Assembly. To conclude, Madam President, we have heard mention of Iran over and over again. We have heard Hamas, Hamas, Hamas over and over again. But we haven't heard mention of the real reason for this situation, which is the occupation, the occupation, the occupation. Once the occupation comes to an end, then we can talk about compliance with the resolutions of the Security Council and of the General Assembly. Bolivia will never, ever justify terrorism. But at the same time, we will not fall into the trap of hearing that the problem is Hamas, when the basic problem, the essential problem, is that a state recognized by this organization is illegally occupying the territory of another state. It is subjecting a people to inhumane, subhuman conditions. This is a systematic violation of the Charter of the United Nations. It is only when the occupation comes to an end that we can say that we have done our duty. Thank you, Madam.
I thank the representative of Bolivia for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Sweden.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and thank you, Special Coordinator Mladenov, for your very sobering briefing this morning. As we had the open debate only some 2 weeks ago, I will focus my remarks today on the immediate situation in Gaza. Madam President, we are appalled by the violence that we have witnessed in Gaza since the March 30th, and in particular the sharp escalation yesterday. Every lost life is a tragedy, but the numbers of killed was the highest in a single day since the beginning of the protests. Indeed, it was the bloodiest day since the last conflict in Gaza in 2014. Yesterday, at least 60 Palestinians were killed by Israeli security forces, and over 2,000 were wounded. Yet again, the Israeli security forces used live ammunition, including when shooting at children. There are reports that several children under the age of 18 were amongst those killed yesterday, in addition to the 7 children killed in the preceding weeks. We condemn the killings, and we express our condolences for the tragic loss of life. As we have stated repeatedly, Israel has a right to protect itself and the people within its borders. That said, Israel, as the occupying power, has a responsibility to protect Palestinian civilians and must fully respect the right to peaceful protest, protect civilians, and ensure that the use of force and other measures taken are strictly proportional. Lethal use of force should be exercised with maximum restraint and only as a last resort. These incidents raise serious concerns as to their compatibility with international law, and there must be an independent and transparent investigation as called for by the Secretary General, among many others. We urge all parties to act with the utmost restraint to avoid further loss of life and to protect civilians, particularly children. This means never making children the target of violence, as well as not putting children in harm's way or encouraging them to participate in violence. We urge the Israeli security forces to refrain from the use of force against unarmed civilian protesters and representatives of the media. We also call on Hamas and those organizing the demonstrations to avoid any provocations and ensure that protests remain non-violent and peaceful. In addition, we must not forget that the people of Gaza have lived in intolerable conditions for far too long, in a humanitarian situation that is now deteriorating even further. To tackle this situation and to enable Gaza to recover, movement and access restrictions must be eased. We support the proposal just made by the UK on the need to come forward with concrete ideas in this regard. Madam President, during these days, Israelis and Palestinians commemorate defining moments in their history that serve as important reference points for both peoples. The position of Sweden and the whole European Union on the status of Jerusalem as a final status issue is clear and will not change. All three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, have strong bonds to Jerusalem that must be preserved. A way must be found through negotiations to resolve the status of Jerusalem as the future capital of both states, in line with relevant UN resolutions. In line with long-standing policy of the European Union, we will continue to respect international consensus on the status of Jerusalem, embodied in, among others, Security Council Resolution 478, including on the location of diplomatic representation, until the final status of Jerusalem is resolved. As was stated in December last year, we regret the US decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It runs counter to international law and this Council's resolutions. Madam President, our immediate priority must now be to defuse the current tensions on the ground and more demonstrations are expected today and in the coming days. The lethal violence cannot be allowed to continue. All parties must take immediate steps to de-escalate, and this Council has a responsibility to actively promote such efforts. We regret that the press statement proposed by Kuwait yesterday could not be adopted, and we hope that a way forward on an appropriate public expression can be found without further delay. There is unanimity around this table, I believe, in calls for restraint, for de-escalation, to break the cycle of violence, relieving the dire situation in Gaza, and for resumed serious negotiations towards peace. Increased regional instability must not contribute to marginalization of the Israeli-Palestinian question. We must, more than ever, urgently engage to bring the parties back to negotiations to advance a two-state solution. Intra-Palestinian reconciliation and the Palestinian Authority's re-establishment in Gaza are also needed. A halt to settlements and an end to the ongoing Israeli occupation are fundamental. It is time for a relaunch of the Middle East peace process. I thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Sweden for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Peru.
Señora Presidente.
Madam President, thank you for convening this emergency meeting. We thank Mr. Mlano for his comprehensive and very concerning briefing. Peru is appalled at the situation in Gaza, where at least 60 Palestinians died only yesterday. To them are added dozens more mortal victims and thousands of wounded over the past days and weeks. We note with particular sorrow that many of the victims are minors. These are unacceptable actions. They go against the minimum standards of coexistence, the development of international law, of international humanitarian law, and of human rights. They increase instability in the Middle East. Peru believes that the acts of violence that took place yesterday and in recent weeks, because of their scope and effects on human lives, should be subjected to an exhaustive, transparent, independent investigation, which will determine the facts and the responsibilities. There should be a specific setting of the degree of compliance with the principles of proportionality, precaution, and legality by the Israeli authorities and troops, to the degree that they maintain that they are acting in legitimate self-defense. It should also be specified if, on the Palestinian side, there were acts of violence and incitement beyond the exercise of the rights and freedoms of association and expression. We agree with Secretary General Antonio Guterres about the need for Israel to calibrate the use of force and to minimize the use of live ammunition. Lethal force should be used only as a last recourse under the imminent threat of death or severe injury. Likewise, In line with the statement of the Secretary General, we believe that Hamas and the leaders of the Gaza demonstrations should keep the demonstrators away from the Israeli fence and avoid all violent actions, provocations, and attempts to breach the fence. We should also stress once again that any assessment of the violence in Gaza should promote appropriate the appropriate response, rather, to its root causes, particularly the tragic humanitarian situation of its population. If this is not the case, the consistent scarcity of goods and basic services, as well as the shutting in of millions of Palestinians, will continue to create an ideal scenario for those who promote violence and extremism. Peru believes that the deplorable events that bring us together are once again a proof of the deep, progressive deterioration of the political and humanitarian conditions underlying the Palestinian question, as well as the lack of prospects for a definite solution. In this fragile environment, we note with concern that unilateral decisions and actions adopted around the city of Jerusalem may degrade into a greater escalation of violence. We should recall that the final status of Jerusalem must be directly negotiated between the parties. Once again, we call on political authorities and leaders, as well as religious and social ones, both on the Palestinian and Israeli side, to act with moderation and encourage the establishment of a high-level dialogue leading their respective people and the Middle East towards a sustainable peace. Once again, we affirm our call on the parties to resume direct negotiations with a view to reaching a definite solution to this conflict on the basis of the relevant resolutions of the United Nations, of two states living in peace side by side within mutually and internationally recognized borders. We conclude, Madam, by indicating that it is urgent for the Council to be united, not only on the resolutions adopted and the responsibilities assigned to it by the Charter for International Peace and Security, but because of a moral obligation to defend life above anything else. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Peru for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Equatorial Guinea.
Muchas gracias, señora.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation wishes to thank Kuwait, first of all, for this emergency meeting on the Middle East, especially on the severity of the recent events between Israel and the Gaza Strip. We also thank the President for having convened us in such a timely fashion. We are also grateful to Mr. Nikolai Mladenov for his brief, clear, and comprehensive briefing. Madam President, we have all witnessed the bloody events yesterday in the Gaza Strip. They were streamed on news channels throughout the world. It is estimated that over 50 people have lost their lives, including children, that there are more than 2,500 Palestinian women, 1,300 of them because of the shooting of the Israeli containment force. All of this added to the death and damage which took place since the beginning of the Great March of Return last March, jeopardizes any hope of peace, security, and stability in Gaza. My delegation deplores these deaths, and we call on the international community to do its utmost to remedy this situation. As we said at the previous emergency meeting on the 30th of March, the Republic of Equatorial Guinea calls on the parties to refrain from any act which could lead to violence. Violence should cease immediately on both sides, and each party should comply with international law as established in the various resolutions of the United Nations. Madam President, these incidents not only heighten existing tensions, they also worsen the socio-economic and humanitarian instability which the population of Gaza has been experiencing for many years now. This is clear in the request for emergency medical equipment to neighboring Egypt and the possibility of transferring the wounded. Equatorial Guinea believes that the historic demands of the Palestinians are fair in accordance with the various pronouncements of the African Union in this regard. We also believe that Israel has the right to live in peace and security. Israel must recognize, likewise, that they cannot deny that just as the right of Israel to exist cannot be denied, that of Palestine to exist cannot be denied either. It is only in this way that two independent states can exist with Jerusalem being shared as their capital. Thus, both parties must comply with international legality. When we deal with the Palestinian question, we cannot overlook the important role that countries with political influence can play in the Middle East. They must play a prominent role as arbiters and mediators between the warring parties. On the basis of compliance with the solutions that have been put forward by this high organization, in which we all trust to prevent and resolve conflicts in the world. Thank you.
The representative of Equatorial Guinea for her statement. And now I give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam
President, I would like to start by thanking Nikolai Mladenov for his very precise and edifying presentation, and thank him for his composure that he has kept under particularly difficult circumstances, given the developments that he continuously warned us about. The days of yesterday and today are the highest point of the month and a half of violence and repression by the Israeli forces against the Palestinian protests in Gaza. The warnings issued since the end of March in this council, in particular France, were not heeded. The escalation on the ground has followed its inevitable course and resulted yesterday in the tragic figures of 60 protesters killed in one day, which brings to about 100 the number of Palestinian protests killed by the Israelis in about a month and a half. This figure is tragic in and of itself. The first point I want to do is the current situation in Gaza, and it's a new tragic illustration of the human consequences of the impasse in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and a consequence also of the absence of any kind of a political prospect. We have been saying this for years. The reality in Gaza is not tenable. The violence we are witnessing are rooted in the decades of the Israeli blockade and aggravated by the impasse in the reconciliation process and humanitarian consequences. The manifestations of last week, supported by Hamas, are rooted in these following situations. There's an absence of any kind of a political prospect, as I said, on the peace process with Israel, and as well as on inter-Palestinian reconciliation, an absence of any kind of a political future, which is maintained by the land, air, and sea blockade, and with the unemployment rate, which is one of the highest in the world, about 40%, and the wealth by each habitat, which is lower than they had about 25 years ago. Another factor here is that the population is very young. The people under 18 years old are about half of the population, and they, instead of hoping for peace, that was replaced in them by the feeling that they have nothing to lose. This tragedy cannot be disassociated from the despair amongst the people of Gaza, and that is why, above and beyond the de-escalation, which is an immediate imperative, above and beyond the humanitarian response, it is absolutely indispensable to work towards a sustainable solution for Gaza within the broader prospect of two states. And that is why we invite Nikolai Mladenov to engage in this kind of a substantive work in the Gaza Strip. The second point I want to make, Madam President, is this. The result of the repression of the daily protest, which have been going on since the 30th of March, is dramatic. Yesterday, another threshold has been breached, which could create a point of no return and a cycle of violence beyond all control. Since the 30th of March, about 99 people, out of whom 6 6 miners were killed when they were protesting along the separation barrier in Gaza. And this is directly related to the response, which is inadequate and disproportionate response by the Israeli security forces. The President Macron clearly condemned yesterday, he condemned the violence of the Israeli armed forces. And all possible light should be shed on these tragic events. We would like to recall here the request made by the Secretary General to have an independent and transparent investigation of this. In the immediate future, 2 conditions have to be imposed in order to put an end to this cycle, which could continue today with the demonstration links to the commemoration of the 70 years of exile by the Palestinians since 1948. First, the respect of international humanitarian law, which fully applies to the Gaza Strip, in particular, the must imperative to protect the civilians. On the other hand, the respect of human rights, and in particular, the right to peacefully protest. It is within this framework that Israeli measures to protect their security need to be contained. This is a legitimate concern, and we share it. We would like to call on Israeli authorities to be discerning, show restraint, and not to use force disproportionately. Israel has the rule of law and therefore needs to apply the rules of engagement, which are in line with international standards when it comes to maintaining order, in line with its international obligations. We condemn the indiscriminate firing against protesters, which was something that was systematic in the course of the last weeks, in particular yesterday. Nothing can justify this. The use of lethal weapons should be excluded when dealing with disarmed protesters who do not represent a grave and imminent danger. This was also a message conveyed by several NGOs, Israeli and Palestinian both. They underlined that they underscore the seriousness of the bullet wounds on protests. So this was outside of any kind of a security need. They also underscore that the medical infrastructure has reached a breaking point in Gaza. In parallel, we call on the protesters to abstain from any kind of excessive violence, and we warn those, and first and foremost Hamas, who would try to instrumentalize the protests or use them in order to undermine the security of Israel along the security barrier. France, as you know, will never be tolerant of undermining Israeli security. In the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank and in Jerusalem, the danger that the situation it escapes all control and deteriorates is very high, and this is in the regional context, which is very tense. In particular, on the northern border of Israel, everyone has to show restraint and responsibility, and first and foremost, the Palestinian and Israeli leaders in their respective statements. Madam President, it's also up to the Security Council to speak with a very strong voice in order to contribute towards stopping the escalation underway. This is a fundamental point. The silence of the Council since the beginning of the crisis is becoming less and less understandable. Since yesterday, it has created a dangerous void, and the silence has to be replaced without delay by a very clear public expression. And France is ready to work on that in a constructive spirit together with its partners. Madam President, the Security Council cannot be prevented from speaking on such a grave topic. It is very vocation, it is very raison d'etre, and it needs, and if it doesn't do that, it loses both. Let me move on to my next point, our collective responsibility to preserve the parameters which will allow at one point in time to have to resolve the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. At the heart of these parameters are the issue of Jerusalem, because it preconditions the peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and therefore regional stability is of concern to the international community as a whole. Jerusalem was the object of several resolutions of the Security Council. Within this framework, the status of Jerusalem has to be considered by the parties in their discussions with a view to a peace agreement. Absent such an agreement, and in line with the consensus the international community has had for 70 years, France recognizes no sovereignty over Jerusalem. Thus, after the conflict of June 1967, we did not recognize the annexation of East Jerusalem because under international law it's part of occupied territories. Similarly, in 1980, we didn't recognize the unilateral acts undertaken by Israel as regards Jerusalem, and this Council passed Resolution 476 and 478, which stipulate two principles. First of all, any decision or action aiming at altering the status of Jerusalem or its characteristics is to be considered null and without effect. It has to be abandoned. And then all of the United Nations member states who had established diplomatic missions in Jerusalem had to withdraw them from the city. And that's exactly what happened after the Resolution 478, and without a single exception. Jerusalem should become the capital of the two states, Israel and Palestine, according to their modalities, which needs to be worked out in the process of a negotiation. No unilateral negotiation can replace that. And France disapproved the decision made by the United States in December and implemented yesterday. We all know that there is no solution other than the two-state solution, but there will be no two-state solution without an agreement between the parties on Jerusalem, and there is no agreement possible on Jerusalem outside of the internationally recognized parameters. Going outside of this framework means feeding the tensions and the violence because of this symbolic, historic and religious importance Jerusalem has for the Palestinians and for the Israelis. It is also opening a space into which all kinds of radicals in the region will rush in. They would be interested in transforming this political conflict into a religious one. Madam President, France cannot see for once again seeing that Jerusalem and the Palestinian territory, starting with the Gaza Strip, descend into chaos. And the President Macron yesterday had a conversation with the King of Jordan, the guardian of the holy sites in Jerusalem, and the President Abbas. And today he will be speaking with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Within the symbolic and historic context of these commemorative days, which are of essential importance both for the Palestinians and for the Israelis, we call each parties to exercise restraint, easement, and to avoid escalation. We call for the resumption of dialogue and negotiations within which the international community has shouldered its true responsibility in order to accompany the parties and ensure results. France, because we are a friend to Israelis and a friend to the Palestinians, intends to continue its efforts with unfailing determination, and we call upon the Council to fully play its role in this regard. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of China.
Madam President, thank you. Madam President, China supports Kuwait's request to convene today's emergency open meeting on the Middle East. And I would also like to thank the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Mr. Mladenov, for his briefing to the Council. Recently, there have been protests and demonstrations in Gaza, and in connection with this, Israel used force, which has caused heavy casualties among Palestinian civilians, including many women and children. We express serious concern at this development. We oppose any violent actions that target civilians, and we call upon both Israel and Palestine, and in particular the Israeli sides, to exercise restraint to avoid further escalation of the tense situation. We express our condolences and sincere sympathy to the victims and their families. And we urge that an objective and impartial investigation be undertaken to bring clarity to what happened. China has consistently advocated that the dispute between Palestine and Israel be settled through peaceful negotiations. China opposes any measures that will aggravate this tension and cause casualties among innocent civilians. We urge the parties concerned to stop violence and abusive use of force, and in particular, to stop actions that target civilians. Use of violence and force will not bring security to anyone. We urge the parties concerned to create enabling conditions, resume contact and dialogue as soon as possible, and strive to return to the right track of the political negotiations. The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip is grave. This is not good for the regional stability. We hope the relevant parties will earnestly implement relevant Security Council resolutions, fully lift the blockade of Gaza as soon as possible, and provide people in Gaza with a normal and a dignified space for survival and development. And we call upon the international community to scale up its assistance and support to the Palestinian people. Madam President, the question of Palestine goes into the heart of the Middle East issue. It is a fundamental question pertaining to the peace in the region. In this connection, the status of Jerusalem is a highly complex and sensitive issue. It concerns the foundation for the settlement of the Palestinian issue. Several resolutions of the General Assembly and the Security Council have provisions relating to this issue. Under the current circumstances, we call upon all parties to bear in mind peace and tranquility in the region, exercise caution, and avoid any words and deeds that may lead to an escalation of the situation, and work together to facilitate the de-escalation of the situation. All parties should respect historical diversity, uphold fairness and justice, implement international consensus, and realize peaceful coexistence. Under such principles and in accordance with the relevant UN resolutions, the final status of Jerusalem should be settled through negotiations in order to reach a solution that takes into account the interest of all parties. The two-state solution is a correct path forward to find a political solution to the Palestinian question. It is also an important guide for action. The international community should adhere to the UN resolutions, the Land for Peace principle, and the Arab Peace Initiative, and resolve differences through negotiations in order to achieve a comprehensive, lasting, and just solution to the Palestinian question at an earlier date. Madam President, China has always supported and promoted Middle East peace process. China has always stood in solidarity with the Palestinian people in pursuing their just cause to restore their legitimate national rights, and promoted the establishment of a Palestinian state with full sovereignty and independence based on the 1967 border with East Jerusalem as its capital. China will continue to make unremitting efforts to achieve peace in the Middle East in accordance with the four-point proposal promoted by President Xi Jinping, and work towards the political settlement of the Palestinian issue. And I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Kazakhstan.
Madam President, my delegation is grateful to the Kuwaiti mission for initiating this emergency briefing on the unfolding situation in Gaza. We also express our appreciation to Special Coordinator Mladenov for his comprehensive and objective update. We were alarmed by the situation in that part of the Middle East. We are extremely concerned about the increase in the death toll caused by violence on the border of the Gaza Strip and Israel. My delegation expresses deep grief following tragically lost Palestinian civilians during protest actions. We consider this is an irreparable loss of lives. Kazakhstan fully supports the right of the Palestinian people to self-expression and peaceful demonstrations. While tensions on the ground are high, Kazakhstan calls on all actors to show responsibility to prevent a new tension and to avoid instigation of violence. We believe this could be dangerous, evolving of the situation in the Middle East region as a whole. In this regard, Kazakhstan calls on both sides of the conflict to exercise restraint. The Republic of Kazakhstan calls on the international community to take exhaustive measures to immediately end the violence. After several weeks of violence, and in the face of the growing number of Palestinian victims in the Gaza Strip still today, Kazakhstan condemns the indiscriminate use of lethal ammunition against civilians and urge the Israeli authorities to exercise restraint. The investigations should be conducted on all of those cases. We reiterate that Israeli security forces must calibrate the use of force. We recall common duty of the UN member states to protect civilians, especially minors. It is in this vein that we join the position of the OIC concerning the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We endorse the outcomes of the Dhaka Declaration, which was adopted at the 45th session of the Council of Foreign Ministers of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in Bangladesh on May 6, 2018. By that, we reiterate that Jerusalem is the common homeland of different ethnicities and religions. All parties must avoid taking actions that might further escalate the situation, while both Palestine and Israel must respect each other's right to existence. International law is unambiguous about the status of Jerusalem. Any unilateral action in changing the status of the city goes against the letter and spirit of international law, Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, and fuel the violence and instability in the region. It will have to be determined in the framework of negotiations, like all the international agreed parameters, in order to reach a just and lasting solution, namely two states living side by side in peace and security. Kazakhstan considers it important to continue efforts to consolidate the Palestinian ranks on the PLO political platform as a necessary condition to practically realize the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people for the creation of their own independent state. We note that the parties must find a solution for the difficult humanitarian situation of Gaza. This requires CBMs in economic dimension with strong support from the international community. With regard to UNRWA, Kazakhstan reiterates the need of supporting this important mechanism. In this regard, Kazakhstan endorses the concern expressed earlier by the Special Coordinator over the funding of UNRWA this year. A significant reduction of its regular budget has already increased the anxieties for the 5.3 million Palestinian refugees who have already suffered the longest protracted refugee crisis. Lastly, reaffirming the commitment to the decisions and resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly, the Republic of Kazakhstan has consistently supported the early, complete, and comprehensive settlement of the situation in the Middle East within the framework of peaceful political progress. We believe it is urgent to recreate the conditions necessary for the search of a political solution in a regional context already marked by strong tensions. We call upon the leaders of Israel and Palestine, other parties, to take concrete steps to preserve the possibility of peaceful coexistence and solution as two states, and strengthen the prospects for peace while being calm and exercising the maximum restraint in order to avoid acts that erode and derail peaceful efforts and further escalate tensions between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It should be based, as we always say at the Council, on the inalienable rights of Palestinians to statehood and Israel's to security. It is necessary to begin in the very near future negotiations on each existing problem aimed at reaching agreement on pending issues and giving them a so-called final status. We believe that only political solution and CBMs in different dimensions could help the parties to resolve the contradictions. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kazakhstan for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Mr. Mladenov for his briefing. We have been following the escalation of violence in the occupied Palestinian territory and the high number of Palestinians killed and injured in the Gaza protests. Let me join others in expressing our deepest sorrow and sympathy on the loss of lives and wish a speedy recovery for those injured. I would like to echo what the Secretary General said yesterday through his spokesperson, and I quote, Israel's security forces must exercise maximum restraint in the use of live fire. Hamas and the leaders of the demonstrations have a responsibility to prevent all violent actions and provocations, end of quotation. Madam President, We are also having this meeting against the backdrop of an ongoing discontent from Palestinians in the region over the latest developments surrounding the issue of the city of Jerusalem. Of course, we have expressed our position on this issue unequivocally, and this is in line with the African Union position, which Chairperson Moussa Faki reiterated yesterday. We believe the Jerusalem issue is a final status issue that must be resolved through direct negotiations between the two parties on the basis of the relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, taking into account the legitimate concerns of both the Palestinian and Israeli sides. All this makes it self-evident that unless the peace process is advanced and the underlying problems are solved peacefully, the tragedy at hand would only happen again and again, but eventually getting to the point of no return. That's where we seem to be headed. The situation is that grave, and even much worse violence is becoming more and more imminent. That is embedded in the very logic of the situation. That's why preserving the possibility of finding a solution through the two-state formula is absolutely critical and cannot be avoided. There is no other viable option. All arguments to the contrary are unrealistic and are not consistent with the firm commitment to seek a just and democratic resolution of the problem. That's why it is so critical that ways and means are found to limit the damage that would be caused and to try, no matter how difficult it might be, to continue the peace process and save the two-state formula, which is a long-held position of the United Nations and the international community. But there is no denying the fact that the formula is fast approaching to being unviable, a situation from which no one would benefit, both in achieving greater security or promoting national aspirations. The basic elements around which reliable and sustainable peace can be secured between the Palestinians and the Israelis are two: dependable security for Israel on one hand, and the realization of the Palestinians of their national aspirations on the other. Any attempt to run away from this reality or to ignore same can only lead to the tension, violence, and bloodletting we have been witnessing. The attempt, whether done openly and with no qualms, or in a less transparent manner and far from public gaze, to make the Palestinian quest for justice and fairness a footnote to other issues that the region has in abundance, would no doubt lead to perpetual turmoil with unimaginable consequences for all. The writing is on the wall, and the trajectory is by no means unfathomable. This said, it is the parties that should show flexibility to engage in direct and meaningful negotiation to reach a final settlement on all issues. However, the international community, and particularly this Council, should discharge its responsibility in helping and encouraging the two sides to do so. It's also in this context that we support the initiatives that have been underway to facilitate negotiation between the Israelis and the Palestinians with a view to achieving a comprehensive, just and lasting resolution. The efforts of the Middle East Quartet and its roadmap, the Arab Peace Initiative, as well as the efforts of countries within and outside this Council, are very much appreciated and should be encouraged to continue. I want to conclude, Madam Chair, by expressing profound appreciation to Mr. Mladenov for the very honorable way he has been discharging his responsibilities. We realize how heavy the responsibility is. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Ethiopia for his statement, And now I give the floor to the representative of Côte d'Ivoire.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, my delegation thanks Kuwait for the initiative to convene this emergency meeting on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. I would like to also congratulate and thank Mr. Nikolai Mladenov for the high quality of his presentation. Madam President, Côte d'Ivoire is particularly concerned by the serious events on the border between Israel and the Gaza Strip within the framework of the March of Return. The violence, which started on the 30th of March, had reached the highest point yesterday with the transfer of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. Given this new outburst of violence, which cost the lives of about 100 Palestinians and wounded about 8,000 since the 30th of March, given this, we call on the parties to show restraint and to abstain from unilateral actions which could compound the situation and push back the prospects of a peaceful solution to the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. Madam President, Côte d'Ivoire remains convinced that there is no alternative to looking for peace through dialogue. We therefore urge all of the parties to return to the negotiating table and to engage in constructive dialogue on the basis of relevant Security Council resolutions and the General Assembly ones. In this regard, we reaffirm our position of principle. We call for a negotiated settlement which should lead to a two-state solution. Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. As regards the final status of the city of Jerusalem, here Côte d'Ivoire thinks that it needs to be come out of a concerted negotiation between the two parties, as is prescribed by the relevant resolution of the United Nations. We therefore call for a resumption without delay of talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians, so as put an end to the political impasse in which the peace process currently finds itself. Madam President, to conclude, my delegation endorses without reservation the goal of comprehensive and lasting peace in the Middle East, and would like to reiterate that we are available to work together with all of the members of the Council in order to find a peaceful outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Côte d'Ivoire for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Netherlands.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I join others in thanking Nikolai Mladenov for his sobering briefing. We deplore the loss of lives and the number of people wounded, as he described. Madam President, as I said last month in this Council, we cannot afford to put the peace process on the back burner. The gap between both sides is deepening fast, as illustrated by yesterday's events. These events underline that the current trajectory leads to the loss of lives, confrontation, and despair. And it results in growing divisions between Israelis and Palestinians. Madam President, I will focus on 3 points. First, the demonstrations in Gaza. Secondly, the issue of Jerusalem. And thirdly, the importance of the peace process and the role of this Council. Madam President, my first point, the demonstrations in Gaza. We are alarmed by the new levels of violence. And as Mr. Mladenov said, 59 people killed, more than 2,600 people wounded, out of which 770 by live ammunition. This is the highest number of people killed in Gaza in one day since the conflict of 2014. The numbers suggest that almost 1 in 40 people was hit by live ammunition, and that 1 in 16 people was wounded by live ammunition. This raises serious questions regarding the proportionality of the Israeli response. We are particularly worried by the killing of children and minors and the high number of health workers hurt. It underlines again the need for restraint and the need for an independent, transparent and prompt investigation into all incidents that led to the casualties. We take note of the fact-finding assessment mechanism established by the Israel Defense Forces to review IDF actions and specific incidents that have taken place on the Israeli-Gaza border since March 30th, 2018. While recognizing Israel's legitimate security concerns, we repeat our call upon Israel to ensure that its responses are necessary and proportionate at all times, in line with Israel's obligations under international law. The use of live ammunition should be a measure of last resort only, as stated in the basic principles on the use of force and firearms by law enforcement officials. We strongly urge all Palestinian parties to ensure the peaceful character of protest and not to resort to violence. Calls to storm Israel and calls for the use of violence are unacceptable. Peaceful demonstrations should not be used as a cover for violence. The demolition of the Palestinian side of the Karem Abu Salem crossing only harms the Palestinian interests. We call upon the de facto authorities in Gaza to ensure the safety of this crossing. It is the only crossing for the entry and exit of food and medical supplies and other goods and should be protected. We call upon the Palestinian Authority and upon the de facto authorities in Gaza to repair the damage as soon as possible. We welcome Israel's decision to resume and ensure the normal functioning of the crossing today, despite the challenging environment. These developments show that a structural solution for Gaza is needed now, more than ever. And at the same time, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza has to be addressed. And we would like to ask Mr. Mladenov to present his ideas and proposal on what can be done in this regard. Madam President, my second point concerns Jerusalem. The future status of Jerusalem is perhaps the most sensitive and the most complex of all final status issues. Jerusalem is a holy city for Jews, Muslims, and Christians. The ties of the Jewish people to Jerusalem are irrefutable and must not be denied. The ties of the Palestinian people to Jerusalem are irrefutable and must not be denied. This calls for wisdom, this calls for prudence. Unilateral steps regarding the future status of Jerusalem are not only unwise and counterproductive, they are, above all, contradicting international law. But they cannot be used as an excuse for violence. Madam President, we will continue to respect the international consensus on Jerusalem as embodied in, inter alia, UN Security Council Resolution 478, including on the location of diplomatic representations, until the final status of Jerusalem is resolved through negotiations. Madam President, my third point concerns the peace process and what this Council can and should do. Looking at the whole picture, first of all, it is de-escalation that we need in the current situation. This pertains to Jerusalem, to Gaza, and also to Israeli-Palestinian relations at large. All parties should focus on diffusing tensions and enable efforts towards a better future for the region. While wisdom and courage is needed to go back to negotiations for a political solution, both sides are taking steps that are incompatible with Resolution 2334. The speech Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas delivered on the 30th of April contained unacceptable remarks concerning the origins of the Holocaust and Israel's legitimacy. Such rhetoric will only play into the hands of those who do not want a two-state solution. Israeli political leaders who advocate for annexations of parts of the West Bank only play into the hands of those who do not want a two-state solution. So we call upon both sides to take steps that create mutual trust and that contribute to the preservation of the possibility of the two-state solution. The current tension should not be used as an argument against action. On the contrary, they demonstrate the urgency of more resolute action now. Only a two-state solution will realistically allow both sides to fulfill their aspirations, to put an end to the conflict, and to achieve the just and lasting peace that Israelis and Palestinians long for and that they deserve. We call upon the members of the Quartet to convene to address the negative spiral. The situation in Gaza worsens with each passing week, and therefore we believe that a united reaction by this Council is urgently needed to help de-escalate the situation. In conclusion, Madam President, we are willing to engage with the other Council members to formulate an appropriate public expression that addresses the recent events and that addresses all unhelpful steps by both sides. We are convinced that this can be done in a balanced manner. This will enable this Council to contribute to de-escalation of the current situation. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Netherlands for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to start by expressing condolences to the families of the killed Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and wish a speedy recovery to the wounded. We mourn together with the Palestinian people. We would like to thank the Special Coordinator, Nikolai Mladenov, for the substantive report. Moscow is deeply concerned by the escalation of tension in the occupied Palestinian territories. It reached a dangerous level against the background of the ceremony which symbolized the beginning of the transfer of the American embassy from Tel Aviv. This also coincided with the momentous date for all Palestinians, the day of catastrophe, or Nakba. The number of victims is something that is a cause of serious concern, and we share all the feelings expressed by Security Council colleagues about that. The Security Council resolution state unequivocally that the resolution of all of the issues related to the definitive settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian situation can only be done exclusively through a direct dialogue between the leadership of Israel and Palestine. We think that this also applies to Jerusalem, the city which needs to be open for the representatives of all three monotheistic religions. Unilateral actions in order to review the agreements which were enshrined in the decision passed by the international community have become worryingly frequent. It is obvious for us that they cannot help with the attaining of just and lasting peace. And when it comes to the Middle East settlement, they cannot implement the national aspirations of the Palestinians or ensure the security of Israel. Unfortunately, those who undertake them not only do not demonstrate their readiness to see reason and stop, but they try to provoke new states, and this increases the risk of their involvement of the destructive Middle East conflict. We reaffirm the right for peaceful protest, and we firmly condemn the indiscriminate use of force against civilians. We call on sides to refrain from steps which could further worsen the situation. These events have shown yet once again that within the political vacuum, which has been in existence for about 4 years, the appeals to have decisions by force or change the earlier agreements are becoming increasingly high impact and destructive. But they have a very specific price, and the price is expressed in human lives, in tears, in broken lives, and dashed hopes. But irresponsible politicians are not stopped by that. As a result, we end up with a vicious circle when violence follows violence. Given these explosive conditions, there is a need to urgently intensify the efforts by the international community aimed at resuming the political process between the Palestinians and Israelis on the basis of well-known international legal basis. This includes the Security Council decisions and principles which are contained in the Arab Peace Initiative. And the outcome of this should be the implementation of the two-state formula and creating an independent and sovereign Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem. We, on our part, will continue to consistently facilitate the two-state solution approved by the international community for the Israeli-Palestinian settlement. We have offered our mediation offices more than once. We have offered to host a summit between the leaders of Palestine and Israel in order to launch a direct dialogue. And this offer of ours remains in force. The vacuum in constructive international efforts, as was shown by recent events, is very dangerous. We think in particular that it is timely to reactivate the work of the Middle East Quartet of international mediators, which remains, no matter what anyone says, a universal, unique mediation format, which is enshrined in Security Council resolutions. We also welcome and support the involvement in the Middle East settlement of constructively minded regional players, in particular Egypt. We underscore the importance of work which is being carried out by the UN and specialized agencies at the occupied Palestinian territories and in refugee camps. It is irreplaceable for the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, the support that is they receive from the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East. To sum up, I would like to point out the following. Despite the ambitious plans of some international players and their grandiose projects, recently, the world, including the region of the Middle East, has not become safer. Many international actions were undertaken, which are at variance with international law, and they only compounded the destabilizing tendencies. And the situation in the Palestinian territories now is a good example of the fact that the situation is going in the wrong direction. Unfortunately, in the past days, we have the ever firm conviction that those who undertake such steps have no intention of changing that direction. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for his statement, and now I shall make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Poland. At the outset, let me thank the Special Coordinator Nikolai Mladenov for his very comprehensive, but unfortunately profoundly alarming briefing. We express our great concern about tragic loss of human lives in the Gaza Strip. During protests near the Gaza fence, high number of people have been killed and injured, unfortunately including children. As we might face more tensions in the coming days, we call on everyone to show the utmost restraint to avoid further escalation of violence resulting in loss of life. We condemn all acts of terrorism as well as incitement to violence, and we expect all to ensure that civilians, and particularly children, are not put in any danger. We call for an independent and transparent investigation into these incidents and further call for respect for international human rights law and international humanitarian law, including protection of civilians. While recognizing Israel's right to protect its border, we strongly underline that the use of force must be proportionate. In this context, let me stress that Israel must exercise maximum restraint in the use of live fire. While talking about demonstrations, we emphasize that Israel must respect the right to peaceful protests, while Hamas and those who are leading the demonstrations in Gaza must ensure that they remain peaceful, strictly non-violent, and without any provocations. We call upon all parties to strictly comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law. Given the number of the casualties among civilians in the recent escalation in the Gaza Strip, it is our imperative to protect them at all levels. Therefore, we encourage all efforts to enhance protection of civilians and respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law by parties to conflict. The current situation in Gaza could have significant consequences on regional and international peace and security. Last 3 conflicts in Gaza in the past decade were a clear example of that. Therefore, the Security Council should contribute to de-escalation efforts, including through appropriate public expression. While talking more broadly about last developments, we would like to once again reiterate our firm commitment to the two-state solution, and in this context underline our position on Jerusalem. This position remains unchanged. We strongly believe that aspirations of both parties for Jerusalem must be fulfilled, and a way to resolve the status of Jerusalem as the future capital of both states must be found through negotiations. The status of Jerusalem should also assume mutual recognition of historical relations and national rights of both parties to the city. We will continue to respect the international consensus on Jerusalem, embodying in inter alia UN Security Council Resolution 478, including the location of the diplomatic representations until the final status of Jerusalem is resolved. Let me once again underline that reaching a peace agreement will be possible only through peace talks, based on international law and the principles governing peaceful relations between states. A key element in this context would also be a meaningful dialogue on the 3 main monotheistic religions. I resume now my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Thank you, Madam President. السيدة الرئيسة بداية
Madam President, first of all, I would like to thank Poland in its capacity as President of the Security Council for the holding of this important emergency session. We also would like to express our thanks for the sympathies and the condolences expressed by all members of the Security Council during the minute of silence in honor of our martyrs. We thank the members of the Council for having felt the urgent need to discuss the serious, deteriorating situation in occupied Palestinian territory, in particular in the Gaza Strip, because of the heinous, deliberate crimes committed by Israel against unarmed Palestinian civilians. We also share our deep gratitude towards Kuwait because of the efforts it is making as the only Arab member of the Security Council. We would also like to thank Mr. Mladenov for his briefing. Madam President, we meet today at a sad, painful moment for the Palestinian people with great sorrow and bitterness. We express our most sincere condolences to the families of the martyrs. May they rest in peace. We also wish a prompt recovery to all those injured because of the brutal Israeli attack on the Palestinian people who expressed their resistance in the besieged Gaza Strip on the eve of the sacred month of Ramadan. We condemn in the most emphatic terms the odious massacre committed by Israel in the Gaza Strip. We call for a halt to the military aggression against our people immediately, and we call for a transparent, independent international inquiry to be conducted. The occupation is the main source of violence in our region. Any attempt to falsify this by some does not match reality. To those who have different rhetoric and agendas, we ask, why have you so often blocked a transparent, independent international inquiry? We say this in this Council. We accept the results of such an investigation beforehand, even before it takes place. The Secretary General has agreed to such an investigation. So has Mr. Mladenov and 14 members of the Security Council on many occasions. I reiterate, we accept whatever the outcome of such an investigation is, as long as the other parties accept such an investigation themselves. Why are some blocking the will of the majority of this Council? What is happening on the ground is not clear. If this is not the case, then let us investigate what is happening on the ground. And as I was saying, we accept the outcome of such an investigation. Are the other parties willing for such an independent, impartial, and transparent investigation to take place under the auspices of the Secretary General of the United Nations, so that things will not remain on the level of accusations and mutual suspicion? Let's have such an investigation. Israel continues its brutal attack on unarmed Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip, in a flagrant violation of international law, including international humanitarian law, human rights law, and the provisions on the protection of civilians. What this is a war crime, a crime against humanity, in accordance with the Rome Statute that created the ICC. We have come to the Security Council many times to ask for immediate action to stop the Israeli aggression against our unarmed people, our people who are crushed under the odious Israeli occupation, our people who are suffering from this forced displacement and exile for over 70 years. We have sent hundreds of letters describing what is happening on the ground in terms of the brutal Israeli occupation of our people. We have sent many appeals to implement the provisions of international law, the provisions of international humanitarian law, of human rights law, and the relevant provisions and decisions of the United Nations. We have warned against the crushing of a people as a whole, the various forms of abuse and oppression. We have warned you not to close your eyes to the catastrophic solution in occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and the continued deterioration of conditions in occupied Palestinian territory because of the Israeli occupation, which culminated in the illegitimate U.S. decision on Jerusalem. We have warned you about the constant ongoing impunity of Israel. We have asked for the exceptional immunity to be lifted, which makes it possible for Israel to act as if it were above the law. We have called Israel to be held responsible for its actions and for justice to be done for innocent victims. In the past and for the past 8 weeks, we have begged you constantly to prevent another massacre conducted by Israel, the occupying power. A massacre, the heavy burden of which is borne by our occupied Palestinian people, our young people, our men, our women, our older people, without any discrimination, in the most deliberate fashion. What was the response to all of these calls? Is it possible that you did not hear these calls? Is it possible that the Council did not take all these warnings seriously? Is it possible for us that a single member of this Council prevents it from responding to its most elementary responsibilities by blocking 3 attempts of press statements, which only ask for one thing: a transparent and impartial investigation to find out what is happening on the ground? Why is there this disregard for the lives of innocent Palestinians? How many Palestinians have to die before you take action? And I'm asking this question in your own countries. If a massacre were to take place, and if in 24 hours there are 61 people died, including small children, and over 2,000 injured over the course of just 24 hours, what would you do? Would you accept the Security Council remaining paralyzed? Would you accept it's doing nothing faced with these crimes committed by an occupying power, a cowardly power, a power that hides kilometers away from the inhabitants of Gaza, targeting them with airstrikes, with rocket strikes, and other heinous acts? They are the occupiers. They're armed. They target unarmed people in Gaza. Would you accept that on your own territory? Would you accept the Security Council remaining silent, faced with a massacre perpetrated over 24 hours?
رغم من امتلاك العالم لآليات الإنذار
The world has mechanisms, early warning mechanisms. There are means to mediate. There are means to resolve conflicts. There are even accountability mechanisms. But despite all of this, in the case of Palestine, nothing was applied. You can see what is happening right now on the ground. Why did all of these Palestinians have to die? Why are they not enjoying life this morning with their families? Did they deserve to die? Did these children deserve to die? Did they deserve to be taken away from their parents? The international community indeed passed laws and encouraged the protection of the rights of every human being. Why are Palestinians exceptions? Why? Why should we be the exception? Why do these massacres happen with the Security Council doing nothing? Why are we the exception? Why are you paralyzed? Throughout the last 6 weeks, we have been targeted. You have been paralyzed. Why are we the exception? When are you going to act? How long are you going to follow this double standard? Especially when it comes to those who want to teach us a lesson. Why do they have a double standard when they want to exercise rule over this council? It is so unfortunate that we have to ask this again and again. Israel has historically tried to deprive us of our humanity, of our natural life right to life, to justify its crimes, using its own security as a pretext, as if the occupying power has a right to enjoy security, whilst it denies the same right to the people being crushed by the occupation. They have the right to enjoy security, but we do not. Once again, we are the exception. They have the right to fire live ammunition against us, to kill over 60 people in 24 hours, to injure over 2,000 people, unarmed people. While they have heavy weaponry, they are a kilometer away from these peaceful demonstrations in trenches, and they have all the weaponry they need and more. Today, Madam President, with a heavy heart, the dear Gaza Strip is burying yet again more children, more young people. They are burying more children who simply peacefully demonstrated to protest against their miserable living conditions imposed on them unfairly by the Israeli occupation, to reject the humiliation, the oppression, the servitude to which they are subjected, to call for the rights that are theirs, the right of self-determination, the right of return. Israel, the occupying power, killed 61 civilians in just 24 hours, including 8 children. Israel injured over 2,000 people. Many of them are severely injured, again in less than 24 hours. This raises the number of victims since the beginning of the Great March of Return to 110 martyrs, including no less than 12,000 civilian injured, including at least 150 children. Many of these victims have severe injuries because the Israeli occupying power barbarously used live ammunition. Israel deliberately used ammunition which is lethal or which causes the greatest possible physical injury to Palestinian civilians, leaving them with permanent disabilities. According to the reports of international organizations, many of these victims are severely injured. I call on you to hear these organizations. Invite them. Invite Médecins Sans Frontières and the other aid organizations. They can tell you what kind of weapons were used, which inflict lasting, lifelong physical disabilities on the victims. Their limbs have been amputated. These are barbarous operations. All they show is the inhumanity of the Israeli army against civilians. That's the real definition of terrorism. Any country in the world facing a similar situation to our own would have created the greatest sympathy. We do not accept being the exception. We are the Palestinian people. Madam President, the cruelest penalties have been inflicted on us because Israel is aware that our children are our greatest good. We live for our children. They are our future, the future that we wish for from the depths of our hearts. Madam President, civilians have the right to peacefully assemble and demonstrate. This is an enshrined right. Everybody has that right. The insinuations that Palestinians themselves are responsible for their have the responsibility for their deaths because they are protesting against the occupation are racist, provocative insinuations. The participation of families in demonstrations is proudly used in other countries as proof of a vibrant democracy and a practice of the guaranteed right to peaceful demonstration and the right to speak. 1 million people demonstrated against the attacks in schools, the use of guns in schools, peacefully. But when the same thing happens in occupied Palestinian territory, in occupied Gaza, we're told that we're using human shields. We reject this racist discourse that turns us into excluded victims of humanity. We have the right to demonstrate as families against the occupation and its arrogance. We have the right to exercise our rights. Our men, women, children, and older people have those rights. It's a civilized act. It's accepted in any other country. Why not in ours? Why are we being accused in a racist, fallacious way just because we exercise the same rights as anyone else, even though we are occupied in a much more difficult situation? Like the rest of humankind, we wish to raise our children in love for their country and participate collectively in civilized human actions. Why are we being accused of doing other things? We are not. These activities are not scorned in other countries. Mention is not made of people being used as human shields. We reject this description of peaceful Palestinian demonstrations. All they do is seek to exonerate Israel, the occupying power, from its responsibility in using live ammunition on innocent, unarmed demonstrators and their responsibility for the deliberate mutilation and killing, which strengthens the despair of the Palestinian people and decreases their hope for justice and peace to come to them. This goes hand in hand with the relevant resolutions of the Security Council calling for the protection of civilians in armed conflict, including the protection of children, women, and humanitarian workers, and journalists. These principles should be applied in occupied Palestinian territory, including the besieged and occupied Gaza Strip. No matter what the Israeli version is, it cannot exclude the Gaza Strip from international standards for the protection of civilians. Ensuring international protection is now urgent, especially since Israel, the occupying power, violated international law and clearly dropped its responsibilities to observe international law, in particular the Fourth Geneva Convention, by ensuring the security and the prosperity of Palestinian civilians under occupation. And if we look at this lack of protection for our people, it now falls to the international community in accordance with the Geneva Conventions and also in accordance with the resolutions and commitments of the Security Council itself. The document sent by the Secretary General on the various experiences and forms of international protection for civilians, which was addressed to you when Spain presided the Security Council a year ago,
should not become simply words on paper. You should consider this document and consider it in depth. You need to determine what is possible to do in order to ensure there's international protection for the Palestinian people, because the occupying power has not shouldered that responsibility which it has under international law, which is why it is now your responsibility to ensure international protection for the Palestinian people until the end of the odious occupation of our country, until the independence of Palestine. Madam President, I need to mention the provocative and illegitimate decision made by the U.S. administration about Jerusalem. It's at variance with international consensus, and it violates the relevant resolution of Security Council 478 and 2334. They chose to plump for Israel, which exacerbated the trends and which led to this. No one is questioning the sovereign rights of countries to choose where they have their embassies. Nonetheless, if this right runs counter to international law, if it's counter to Security Council resolutions, it's no longer a sovereign right. No country has the right to imperil our territory and to place an embassy in territory under occupation. You're all aware of the situation in Jerusalem since Resolution 180, which determined the particular status of Jerusalem, as well as all other resolutions on this by Security Council 478 and 2334, and the agreements we have between us and the occupying power. The status of Jerusalem is to be determined in the negotiations of final status issues. No one, on the pretext of sovereignty or any other pretext, has the right to act in flagrant violation of international law and the decisions passed by the Security Council. If we were talking about transferring the embassy from Tel Aviv or Haifa or from Tel Aviv or Ashdod, well, you're free to do so. But transferring the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem is not up to the United States. This is an international law issue. The Trump administration today refuses to listen to what the world is saying, to what is stated in United Nations resolutions, in particular in Security Council resolutions, and in particular what is contained in international law and standards. It refuses to listen to that. This is a superpower which should be defending the international law first and foremost, and that is the superpower which should be protecting the Security Council resolutions before anyone else, because of their position as a permanent member of Security Council and as a superpower. They should be the one to abide by the international law, and they should not trample the international law underfoot. They should not closing their eyes to the situation on the ground. The whole world can see this provocation, and the United States should review their position on this flagrant violation of international law and Security Council resolutions. Furthermore, the U.S. administration did not just ignore the status of the city and the central role it plays in peace as a whole. It decided to transfer the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, while the Palestinian people are commemorating the 17th anniversary of Al-Nakba, the catastrophe. This is another decision where the U.S. administration is totally ignoring our feelings and our legitimate rights and the feelings of Muslims and Christians and all monotheistic religions throughout the world. This is a provocation for millions of Muslims and Christians. The United States took this decision whilst completely disregarding the feelings of everyone, including the Palestinian people. The United States should have, in their capacity as a superpower, to exert pressure on Israel to put an end to their violations against the Palestinian people, to compel them to respect international law and to create the environment conducive to getting out of the political impasse, and to guarantee an environment which is conducive to peace, security, prosperity, and dignity for everyone. But unfortunately, the United States decided to do the opposite. They decided to strengthen the intransigence on the part of Israel. They decided to protect Israel from international condemnation, from their accountability, from any measure which could rectify this unfair situation, unfair to the Palestinians and their right to freedom and independence. This was the most recent decision on Jerusalem motivated the right-wing government in Israel to implement their policies and illegitimate practices, including the broad daylight murder of innocent civilians without any fear of consequences, because Israel has always had impunity. And this fed into the Israeli aspirations of getting control over Palestinian territory, including the illegitimate annexation of East Jerusalem. Madam President, we have to recognize that the absence of accountability and protecting Israel against any kind of sanction is what allows Israel to go even further in their settlement policies and their racist policies against the Palestinian people. They have the green light, which allows them to commit ever greater crimes against innocent people, which enables them to kill a greater number of people, to imprison Palestinians, to confiscate greater stretches of land and houses, and to displace a greater number of people, and to provoke what is happening today in the occupied Palestinian territories, including Jerusalem. This kind of impunity enables Israel to continue with their illegitimate and inhuman blockade of the Gaza Strip. This has been going on for more than 10 years. This blockade witnessed three kinds of devastating years when they tried to destroy our infrastructure, which catastrophically worsened the situation of our 2 million Palestinians. Israel decided to impose collective punishment, which is a war crime. Israel deprived them of protection. This requires an urgent action to rectify the very difficult humanitarian situation. We several times called on the Council to lift the Israeli blockade against Gaza and provide the necessary assistance to alleviate the suffering of people. Unfortunately, this to date has not been done. And we are making these appeals and exhortations today. Recall Resolution 1860 and Council statements on this. We are asking for serious measures to exert pressure on the occupying power to put an end to the blockade and to open crossing points to enable for the free circulation of people and goods in line with the international humanitarian law. We also call for the support of UNRWA, which, despite the financial crisis which was imposed on it, continues implementing its mandate and providing assistance to refugees, and continues playing an important role to alleviate the suffering of people in the Gaza Strip and meet their urgent needs. Madam President, we call on the Security Council to work without delay to resolve the sensitive issue which threatens international peace and security. The Council must act immediately to stop the massacre committed against our people, in particular now in Gaza. Council cannot remain silent. The Council must demand that its resolutions be respected. We call upon all countries to work on this together and individually in order to support the international law. And this should include condemning the illegitimate and brutal attitude of Israel towards the Palestinian people under occupation. We shouldn't recognize the settlement of Israel now territories, including East Jerusalem, and undertake measures in order to ensure there is accountability and justice. Further, we need to act urgently in order to save the lives of innocent civilians and prevent the deterioration of the situation, and save any possibility, however minimal, to have just peace. And that's why international protection needs to be extended to the Palestinian people in line with international humanitarian law. 70 years after Nakba, the catastrophe, injustice, and a shock, the Palestinian people continue to believe, together with others in the world, together with all of you, that the international law is the way to justice, given this is the surest way towards peace. States should translate their words into action. It's time for immediate action, serious actions, to make sure the primacy of international law and to resume efforts to put an end to Israeli occupation, have just and lasting peace, to make sure that Palestinian people can live in dignity and in peace. They can have their inalienable rights, exercise them, including the right to self-determination and to freedom in an independent Palestinian state, and have the right of return. Our people have waited for a long time. We have suffered for a long time. We can no longer wait for an end to this grave injustice. Please do not disappoint our hopes and our aspirations. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. I will begin today by sharing the facts. For the past month, Israel has faced violent riots at the security fence with the Gaza Strip. These were not demonstrations. These were not protests. These were violent riots. Rioters have thrown Molotov cocktails, planted explosive devices, and rolled burning tires. They have sent flaming materials over the fence, igniting widespread fires on Israel's southern agricultural lands. They have repeatedly attempted to forcibly breach the fence and infiltrate Israeli territory with the explicit goal of killing Israelis. Hamas, an internationally recognized terrorist organization, has taken the people of Gaza hostage. This past Friday, a Hamas-led mob set fire to the Kerem Shalom border crossing terminal and destroyed large parts of it. This crossing is a major entry point for outside goods to enter Gaza. The damage set gas lines and electricity infrastructure on fire and will cost millions of dollars to repair. But Hamas doesn't care. It values destruction over prosperity, death over peace. Israel has known this fact for a long time. We were reminded of it just last week when the IDF found and destroyed the 9th Hamas terror tunnel since last October. This tunnel started in Gaza, running alongside the Erez pedestrian crossing and ending just meters from a village inside Israel. Its goal was terror, to kill and kidnap Jews in the surrounding Israeli towns. Hamas lives on death, but not just the deaths of Israeli civilians. As we have reported time and again, Hamas is guilty of exploiting the innocent people of Gaza as human shields. Hamas terrorists hide behind these innocents, often young children, and place them directly in the line of fire. The facts and the footage do not lie. Hamas is committing grave violations of international law. Its terrorists continue to hide behind innocent children to ensure their own survival, while its leaders incite the people of Gaza to violence. Yahya al-Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza, recently said to a group of Palestinian youth, and I quote, "We favor assassination over a natural death and are always willing to sacrifice our lives." A few days ago, a Hamas member who was captured after attempting to cross into Israel provided critical insight into Hamas's plot. I will reveal some of what we have learned. 1. Hamas is instructing its activists to cut the fence and steal Israel's security cameras in order to sabotage and topple the fence and disrupt IDF activity. 2. Hamas wants the riots it is instigating to be seen in the international media as a popular uprising, not as violent action led by its militants. And 3, most importantly, Hamas terrorists are hiding behind civilians during the riots. However, if the fence is breached, heavily armed Hamas terrorists will enter Israeli territory under cover of the mob to carry out attacks on Israeli civilians. Those are the facts. When it comes to the mob rushing to the fence, too many in the international community never miss an opportunity to legitimize the Palestinian voice of violence. But when it comes to the safety of the Israeli public, too often the world is silent. This is one of the leadership's most cherished tactics. The cycle of death works like this. First, they incite people to violence. Then they place as many civilians as possible, including women and children, in the line of fire to maximize civilian casualties. Then they blame Israel, and then they come here to complain to the UN. This is the deadly game the Palestinians play, and they play it at the expense of innocent children. Once again, the Palestinian leadership is using every ounce of its energy to attack us and to attempt to destroy us. One of the players of this game is sitting right across the room, the Palestinian representative. He left the room. Like Abbas, we can hear spoken left. It's a routine. Mr. Mansour and his friend, they are guilty of placing young Palestinian children in harm's way. They are killing their own people. They are guilty of exploiting them for the disgraceful public relations game. We predicted this situation many months ago because the Palestinians always employ the same strategy of manipulation. Every time the Palestinians have an opportunity to change the course of history, to partner with us on the path of peace, they always choose violence. They never fail to miss that golden opportunity to build a better future for their children and for ours. But the Palestinian leaders are not the only participants in this scheme. Some in the international community are playing into their hands. They are falling into this trap, giving the Palestinians the attention they seek, and they are legitimizing Palestinian lies and violence. Israel has witnessed this pattern over and over again since our earliest days. Even in 1947, we watched the Palestinians miss their first opportunity. The United Nations proposed the creation of both a Jewish state and an Arab state in the land of Israel. The Jews were given just a portion of our historic homeland. Yet, we accepted it. We took it. But the Arabs said no. The Palestinians could not bear the thought of sharing what was our land to begin with, so they launched a war upon us. Israel ultimately won that battle, but Palestinian lies and violence did not relent, and too many in the international community let them get away with it. They falsely equated Zionism with racism. They saluted the Palestinian cause while Israelis were murdered, kidnapped, and forgotten. They sided with Palestinian killers, often with no questions asked. Fast forward to 2005. You forgot about it. Israel disengaged from Gaza. We left completely. No Jewish community. You call it settlement, occupation. We took out the entire Jewish communities out of Gaza. Even the people who buried in Gaza, we took them out. No IDF, no checkpoints, no civilians, nothing. We left. Prime Minister Sharon decided to try. We left Gaza in 2005. Gaza could have become a Palestinian success story, maybe the Singapore of the Middle East. It has the potential. But Gaza could not reach its potential because Hamas took over in 2006. Instead of investing in education, infrastructure, and the economy, Hamas lives and breathes death and destruction. Hamas spends all of its energy and resources terrorizing Israel and exploits the population of Gaza to meet that end. Madam President, let me be very clear today. When the Palestinians say days of rage, they mean days of terrorism. When the Palestinians say right of return, they mean destruction of Israel. And when the Palestinians say peaceful protest, they mean incitement and violence. The common denominator throughout our history has been the following. The international community, with a few brave exceptions, does nothing to stop the Palestinians from trying to terrorize Israel on the world stage. But the fact is that whoever supports the Palestinian ploy becomes a player in the cycle of death. Only by breaking this cycle of orchestrated riots, planned casualties, and pleas for UN sympathy will justice truly be served. Madam President, Israel is marking two major milestones. We are celebrating 70 years since our people re-established our sovereignty and independence by founding the State of Israel in the land of Israel. And we are welcoming with gratitude President Trump's decision to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, our ancient and eternal capital. This was a step for peace because in any peace agreement, Jerusalem will be Israel's capital. Everyone who claims the decision to move the U.S. Embassy is the reason or the justification for Palestinian violence should take another look at history. This is an excuse, not a reason, for violence against Israel. If this body truly seeks to uphold security, justice, and truth, then it will stop right here and now, condemn this terror, and reaffirm Israel's right to defend itself. Madam President, the Security Council must set the standard of behavior. You must tell Hamas that violence is not the answer. You must ask yourselves, what would you do? What would you do, each one of you, if a violent mob of tens of thousands was threatening to cross your sovereign borders to attack your people? What would you do if your people were faced with terror attacks day in and day out? You must not give in to the cycle of death that the Palestinians have created. You must call out lies when you see them, condemn Hamas's violence, and place yourselves on the side of truth and the right side of history. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.